evening and welcome to For the Record. The European Union, under the European Development Fund, has recently allocated 80 million Fijian dollars for climate change adaptation programs across the Pacific. 15 countries will be covered, including Fiji. And to talk about this funding and the program outcomes, we have with us tonight the European Union Ambassador to Fiji and the Pacific, Mr. Andrew Jacobs. Ambassador Jacobs, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Climate change, of course, is the big issue around the world. The EU, in the last few years, has stepped up and partnered with the Pacific on climate change adaptation. We're talking about the COP meetings and almost every international global arena. The EU has stood on the side of climate change adaptation. This program, $80 million for adaptation, how do you expect to roll it out, and what are the outcomes you expect?
Well, this is an important program, a new program in our portfolio for the Pacific. It's not the only program that we have, helping countries to adapt to climate change and to the challenges that climate change brings. But I think it will provide a lot of very useful support, particularly to help communities to adapt. There are lots of communities, particularly in coastal areas, whose livelihoods and whose existences are really threatened by rising sea waters. So the program will help them to move if necessary. Will help them to build up barriers to the sea. Will help them to increase their resilience to rising waters and to climate change. And at the same time, and very importantly, it provides a lot of support to bring in renewable energy to communities. I think to be able to be self-sustaining when it comes to energy, electricity is very important. It goes hand in hand, I think, with facing up to the challenges of climate change.
It's a statement to the world, because a lot of these countries are having a hard time in securing funding for climate change adaptation. And there you have, on the back of this, the EU coming forward and saying, $80 million, do what you need to do.
Yeah, exactly. I think some of the smaller countries, I mean, Fiji has a lot of resources, and I think is very good at applying for funds. And I know there's been a significant contribution from the Green Climate Fund made available to Fiji. But there are a lot of smaller countries, particularly in the Pacific, which don't have the resources in order to put together good project proposals to get funds. And I think the European Union, by providing this money up front, by arranging this comprehensive program, is helping really to make a difference when other projects perhaps would take rather longer to come on stream.
The way that the Adapting to Climate Change and Sustainable Energy, that's the name of the program, the way
right.
it's been rolled out is there's been a lot of consultation around the region, and you've partnered with the with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Is that in order to ensure that the money goes where it's needed?
No, absolutely. I mean, we're not going to just sit at our desks and decide how the money can be used. We have to consult the communities. We have to consult the organizations which represent the Pacific countries, such as the Pacific Island Forum. And we also need to ensure that we have partners who are implementing the programs, who really know the challenges on the ground, and who have, let's say, a very good awareness of what is needed. A lot of the program, the AXE program, is being implemented by GIZ, the German Development Agency, who have a very good track record in the Pacific, and they are, I think, certainly going to do a very efficient job of making sure that the money goes and the support goes to where it's needed.
15 countries over 5 years.
That's right. Yeah.
Is the money going to be shared equally, or is it on a needs basis? Who gets how much?
I think it's a mixture of both. I mean, certainly we don't want to leave any countries out, but some countries are in greater need than others, and particularly the low-lying atoll countries in the Pacific. I'm thinking of Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and really face an existential threat from climate change. So their adaptation and mitigation needs are perhaps more than some of the other countries which have higher ground. I think Fiji certainly needs a lot of support. There are a lot of communities which are at risk, and I'm very pleased that we have already, identified together with the government of Fiji, communities which should receive financial support and assistance through AXE. I can give you, a few examples of these. I mean, on Ono Island in Kandavo, there's the community of Narikoso. There are there are households which need to move because the sea is really encroaching. So the program will enable them to move to new climate resilient houses, so that certainly they can continue to live their lives, where they've been brought up, but not quite in such a way as their livelihoods are threatened by the rising sea levels. And again, in Wadi Wadi district in the Lao group, there is a school which really is in danger of falling down because of the encroaching sea. So again, the program will enable that school to move back to higher ground, and will enable students to continue their education. The community will continue to have its school, because otherwise, in a few years' time, there would be a real risk that this facility is no longer in existence.
As you roll out this program, how much involvement do you have with the communities directly affected?
An enormous involvement with the communities. I mean, these are projects for the communities. If the communities do not feel strong ownership, then the support risks not being sustainable. We need to listen to the communities to make sure that we're doing what they want us to do, that we're fulfilling their needs in terms of support. And they have the responsibility afterwards to make sure that the houses, the school, for example, are maintained properly, so that they can really continue to serve the community for many years to come.
The $80 million, that's what the EU can give. But
yes.
What would you say is the rough need? What would the budget be if everything on the wish list was to be completed? Not just from the EU, if all the donor agencies and the polluting countries were to step up.
I think it's very, very difficult to estimate how much support in financial terms would be necessary for the Pacific in order to, let's say, provide the necessary assistance to all the communities which are threatened by climate change. I really have no idea. I know that the needs are vast. Which is why we're doing everything we can, not only to provide direct support, but also to help the different Pacific countries and their communities to access funds from other sources. The Green Climate Fund has huge amounts of money available. The European Union member states provide over half of all of the funds through the Green Climate Fund. There is a board meeting of the GCF in Samoa later this year, and I'm sure that there will be a number of new proposals for the Pacific Island countries which will be approved at that board meeting. So I think it is a question of making sure the funds are accessible to those who need them most.
Okay, and with that we come to the end of our first segment. We'll be back shortly. Good evening, welcome back to For the Record. We are speaking with the European Union Ambassador to Fiji and the Pacific, Andrew Jacobs, about climate change and $80 million in funding which has been made available for 15 Pacific Island countries for climate change adaptation. Ambassador, what are the three main components of the Adapting to Climate Change and Sustainable Energy program?
Well, one of the components seeks to provide renewable energy solutions, certainly with a focus on solar energy. We are helping Pacific Island communities to very often to have access to electricity for the first time through solar energy. So that's one of the very, very important, one of the three important components. The second component is providing adaptation solutions to communities who are really threatened by climate change. As I said, there are communities in Fiji which will be benefiting from that support. And thirdly, we have a component which really focuses on education, technical assistance, awareness building of the challenges. So it's quite a comprehensive program. I mean, we see very clearly that renewable energy, providing renewable energy solutions goes hand in hand with tackling climate change. I think it's clear that the Pacific Island countries are in no way responsible for growing emissions which have created the phenomenon of climate change. But I think by bringing in renewable energy, they are really leading from the front, showing more developed countries and countries which are big emitters what really can be done. So I think it's very important that we provide renewable energy solutions, not only to help the communities, but also to help the Pacific Island countries to show that they are really taking the issue of climate change seriously, that they're really leading from the front by bringing in, let's say, opportunities to use alternative sources of energy which don't create the problems that the more traditional energies do.
Oftentimes we see a sort of knee-jerk reaction where there's attempts to save a community or to relocate a community, move them when we come to a realization that it may be too late and they can't continue where they are. Does this program cater for measures which prevent the effects of climate change, talking about going into communities before it's too late?
I think where we can, we will. If it's not too late, there are certainly adaptation measures that can be brought in. For example, raising seawalls, increasing, let's say, vegetation around communities in order to protect them from encroachment, from let's say sand and rocks disappearing into the sea. So certainly we will, if it can be avoided that communities move, we will certainly try to help them to do that. But yeah, I think we have to recognize that in many cases for communities which are very close to the sea, which have already undergone a great deal of erosion, which every year see waves battering houses, see water coming into schools and community centers, there perhaps it is too late to avoid having to move communities and to rebuild them in the area, so families don't have to move to the other side of Fiji, but certainly to move them onto higher ground. I think this is a reality, and it's a reality that I know the Fijian authorities recognise. I know there are several hundred communities which have been deemed to be at risk by the government, and I think that's a serious issue and one that I think we all need to try to tackle together.
Mm-hmm. The writing was on the wall for many years, but a lot of people are waking up to the reality after TC Winston.
Yes.
Did this program have anything to do with what happened in February this year?
I think the program was already planned before TC Winston, but I think it really has helped us to focus on some of the more immediate challenges. I mean, the European Union was pleased very soon after Cyclone Winston to provide some emergency support. We adapted a number of our ongoing programs in order to help farmers to get their crops back growing, so that they can provide food for themselves, for their communities, and to start selling again. We provided 10 million euros, so $25 million in early support for sugar and agriculture. But I think in the longer term, it's these programs which help communities to adapt, which are going to be important. But I agree that Cyclone Winston was a wake-up call. It's not going to be the last cyclone that hits Fiji or the Pacific, and I think it did serve to emphasize to everybody that we need to act. Something really needs to be done.
The implementation, when it comes to work on the ground, how does the GIZ, the German part of this program, come into play?
Well, they're responsible for making sure that the implementation actually happens. They are engaged by the European Union to be the implementer of the project. So it's their responsibility to work with the communities to put the solutions in place. And I know that they have a very strong track record in Fiji and through the Pacific, and that I'm sure that they will do a very competent job in making the program a success.
Apart from Fiji, what are some of the other critical areas? You mentioned Nauru and Kiribati and these other nations as well, but 15 countries is pretty much the South Pacific, isn't it?
It is pretty much the South Pacific, and I think all countries in the Pacific face challenges because of climate change. Even if several of them are not low-lying atoll countries, there are problems with salination of ground, with crops. Certainly facing challenges because of changes in the soil. There are changes in climate patterns which bring drought. which continue to bring weather phenomena such as cyclones, hurricanes, and so on. So all of the Pacific is affected by climate change, and also by the El Nino effect. And this program will be working across the Pacific.
Once the program is complete, does the EU have expectations of what sort of changes we can expect in the longevity of communities and being safe from the effects of climate change? Should it last 10 years, 20 years, a lifetime?
I mean, we can't continue with a program for more than 4 or 5 years, but one of our aims is always to make sure that the communities which are involved in the program, which are benefiting from the program, really take full ownership of the inputs of the work that has been done. And that is the way that we can ensure sustainability. And I think that the program, in addition to providing specific support, is also helping to raise awareness of challenges, but also helping to raise awareness of solutions which are available. So I think one of the ways to judge the long-term success of a program like this is to see the way in which it has managed to change behavior, and so that people are more conscious of the risks that their communities face, that they're more aware of what they need to do to adapt the way in which their communities perhaps behave, to adapt, let's say, the way in which they build their houses in order to protect them better from the effects of climate change, and so on. And I think that's going to be the sustainable, let's say, benefit of this initiative.
At the same time, though, there is a need to raise awareness amongst people in carbon-emitting nations.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
With that, we've come to the end of yet another segment, Ambassador. I'll hold my question for the next segment. We'll be right back. Bulavanaka, and welcome back to the show. My guest tonight is the European Union representative to Fiji and the Pacific, Mr. Andrew Jacobs. We're talking climate change. Ambassador Jacobs, in the last segment we spoke about how there's a need to raise awareness in countries which are at risk from climate change, but at the same time to raise awareness amongst people and the governments who are the largest carbon emitters. That, I think, is where we are struggling more or struggling most right now.
Well, I think that the Pacific Island countries have done a very good job in the last few months in getting their voice heard. I think the big climate change meeting in Paris, COP21 last December, was an opportunity which the Pacific Island countries really took to get the world to listen, to get the world really to hear about the problems faced by those countries which are really at the front line of climate change. And I'm very pleased that the European Union worked very effectively with the Pacific Island countries to try to ensure successfully that there was a strong agreement in Paris to reduce emissions, the Paris Agreement. But I think it was perhaps the first time that the Pacific Island countries had taken this opportunity in such a comprehensive way in order to make the world aware that in several cases their very existences are threatened because of emissions coming from more industrial countries. And the Fiji government, the Fiji Prime Minister, did a very good job of making sure that the world heard the message coming from the Pacific. And there were other leaders, particularly those from Tuvalu, from Kiribati, from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So those countries really, which face the biggest challenges, which managed to get their ideas across. And I think this was really helped by the what was called the High Ambition Coalition. It was a group of countries, a group of partners, led very much by the Republic of the Marshall Islands, by the then Foreign Minister Tony de Brum, and the European Union Commissioner for Climate Action, Miguel Arias Cañete. And this High Ambition Coalition really raised the bar. It made sure that countries in Paris really did make available all of their skills in negotiating an effective agreement, that they were ambitious, and I think we can see that from the result. We can see that from the Paris Agreement, which I think does set a very comprehensive agenda for the reduction of emissions, which is going to benefit not only the Pacific but mankind as a whole.
Now we're almost coming on to a year from when the Paris Agreement was signed or adopted, at least. We'll talk more about Marrakesh, the next COP meeting that's coming up. But going back to my question about the need to raise awareness amongst emitting nations, the European Union Council has some members which are also high emitters of carbon. What is the Council, what is the EU doing about its members who are carbon emitters?
Well, the European Union, which means the 28 member states, have agreed on very ambitious targets for the reduction of emissions. By 2030, the European Union has committed to reduce emissions by 40% over 1990 levels. I mean, this is an extremely ambitious program, but one to which all of our member states are committed. And I think the European Union has been a leading proponent of climate action. We are working towards a low carbon economy, and I think within the European Union, within the people of the European Union, the 500 million people, there is a growing consciousness that all of us are responsible for doing our bit in order to reduce emissions, to reduce climate change, to use alternative sources of energy, to ensure that production processes are less dependent on emissions of damaging gases and so on.
Is there a sentiment that some of these carbon emitters, I mean, I can point to Australia as a classic example, Pacific neighbor, it's part of the region, it's the closest to all these countries which are at threat from climate change, and yet their commitment seems to dwindle every now and again. Is there a sentiment amongst the EU and all these larger nations who've come on board, who are saying it's time to make a change? Does it make you sad?
No, not at all. And I think through initiatives such as the High Ambition Coalition, we have managed to bring in an awful lot of countries with us. I think the tide has turned, if you like. I think the Paris Agreement in December 2015 was really the moment that the world took climate change seriously and the world committed to doing something about it. And I'm confident that this, as I say, really was the turning point.
But even in the Paris Agreement, there were compromises needed, and some of the countries from the Pacific and some of these countries who are at risk are still struggling to see how they would be able to access the funding and the finances. There's a lot of legal work that's involved. I'd like to come back to that in a bit. I think the Paris Agreement and Marrakesh, the talks coming up, need more attention. But going back to the program, the Adapting to Climate Change and Sustainable Energy, at the end of the 5 years, what sort of a review do you expect to do, and what are the prospects for the next 5 years?
We will carry out, as we always do for all of our programs, a thorough evaluation. We need to know whether or not we did the right thing, whether or not there were things that could have been done better. We need to know whether the results really were in line with expectations and in line with the objectives set out at the beginning of the program. Yes, there will be further support. We will be planning new programs, and though the success of those programs will depend on an assessment of what is really successful. So certainly it will be very important for us to take stock of the achievements of the ACSE program, but also all of the other work that we're doing in climate change adaptation, both in Fiji and around the Pacific. We need to build on successes, and we need to avoid, let's say, those elements of projects which perhaps did not go as well as we hoped, which unfortunately is always the case.
Of course, let's turn to the Paris Agreement, as you had mentioned earlier, but right now we have to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about that. It's time for a quick break. Ulonaka, welcome back to For the Record. My guest, the European Union representative to Fiji and the Pacific, Ambassador Andrew Jacobs. Ambassador, I've already pointed to how the Paris Agreement does have shortfalls, very critical ones, which for Fiji at least means that it's harder still to get access to funding, to the hundreds of millions of dollars that should rightly be coming to to this part of the world for climate change adaptation. Is the EU working with Fiji and our neighboring countries to see that there is some sort of headway?
Yeah, I certainly don't think that the Paris Agreement has made it more difficult to access funding. I mean, far from it. The Paris Agreement will result in more support being available. There's a commitment to $100 billion to come on stream from all of the industrialized countries. But I agree that Pacific Island countries sometimes need to have support in order to access funds in the best possible way. I mentioned before that sometimes there is low capacity in some of the smaller Pacific Island countries. So I think we're very conscious of that, and we need to provide these countries with help to put together decent proposals so that they can get the funds which they need, which certainly they deserve. I mean, there were elements which were missing from the Paris Agreement in terms of ambition, particularly in two sectors which have a great impact on climate change. The first of these is civil aviation. And I'm very pleased that at the International Civil Aviation Organization conference in Montreal last week, or a couple of weeks ago, the ICAO conference, there was an agreement to bring in what is called a global market-based measure, which will mean that developed countries which are flying around the world, and 65 countries signed up to this, they will have to purchase climate change credits, which will mean that if they are flying regularly, if they are emitting a lot from their commercial fleets, they will have to make up for that by reducing emissions from industry on the ground. And this will have a major benefit in overall reducing climate change, because as far as civil aviation is concerned, I know that by 2050, on current projections, there will be an increase in emissions from aviation of 300%, which is huge. So I'm very pleased that now civil aviation is facing up to the challenge, is really going to be doing something about it. I mean, countries such as Fiji, the small island developing states, will be exempt from this program, but we hope that more and more countries will sign up to it in order to really help to mitigate the negative effects of civil aviation, which is a sector of industry which will certainly continue to grow. And another sector of industry which again was not focused on specifically in the Paris Agreement is maritime transport. The Pacific, clearly maritime transport is of huge importance. There will be a meeting of the Environment Committee of the International Maritime Transport Organization at the end of this month in London, and we, the European Union, together with, I know, a lot of our Pacific countries, are pushing for there to be a decision at the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to start establishing a real work plan for reducing emissions, to establish a fair share of responsibilities for reducing emissions, because then there again there will be a growth in emissions from maritime transport of between 50 and 250% by 2050. But we are working also there to encourage the use of technology to reduce emissions, and not enough is being done by boat builders at the moment. So again, that is a big focus, and it's been estimated by the IMO that there could be a 75% increase in energy efficiency by using existing technology in ships, and that's something which at the moment is not being used effectively. So again, a big challenge for the maritime transport industry. But I think if we bring in maritime transport, we bring in civil aviation, these areas complement what was agreed in the Paris Agreement. We're going to really be very much on the right track.
A lot of these large carbon-emitting nations argue that they are developing. They have needs to service, needs to their population, their economy, and once they are stable, once they're in a comfortable position to be able to reduce these emissions, they will do so. But there is a bit of reluctance to agree to the 2% cap on carbon emissions. Where's the balance here?
Well, I think, certainly developing countries, or countries which are developing quickly, are big emitters. It's extremely encouraging that China has ratified the Paris Agreement. 77 parties out of 197 who signed the Paris Agreement have now ratified, which means that the agreement comes into force on the 4th of November, which is brilliant news. That's before Marrakesh. The Marrakesh meeting, COP22, takes place between the 7th and 18th of November. And it's at this COP, at this meeting in Marrakesh, when we really have to put in place work programs for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, as I've said, was a huge achievement in agreeing on ambitions and agreeing on what needs to be done. Now, in Marrakesh, the world needs to agree on a work program. It needs to agree on how best to monitor. It needs to agree on how to ensure that the different countries are actually implementing what they promised to implement in Paris.
You've pretty much led me into my next segment, which is Marrakesh. When you talk about implementing work programs and monitoring mechanisms, the EU already has programs in place. You have a deep understanding of what it takes to work, at least in the Pacific region, from what I know. Rolling out this huge mechanism that's it's going to span the globe. We're not talking about something that can be done in 5 years. How much of a long-term plan is this?
Well, it is a long-term plan, but it's really up to the negotiators now in Marrakesh to really decide and agree together on a comprehensive work program for the implementation of Paris, and a comprehensive plan which will ensure that the governments who have committed themselves to reducing emissions really do so, that they are held to account. In each of the countries which signed up to the Paris Agreement made certain commitments called nationally determined contributions, to the effort to reduce emissions. In Fiji, for example, committed to establish a share of renewable energy to at least to approach 100% by 2030. So Fiji's ambition is that by 2030, 100% of energy should come from renewable sources. And other countries, have put together similar pledges. Clearly, for more industrialized countries, for big emitters, it's more complex. And that is, I think, going to be one of the real areas of focus in Marrakesh, how to ensure that these countries really do implement what they have promised to implement, because that is going to be the proof of Paris.
And the Pacific Island nations, including Fiji, have set the benchmark for the message that needs to be sent out at these global meetings. And let's talk about what we are taking to Marrakesh, to COP22. But before we get to that, we have to take another break. We'll be back shortly. Ulunaka, welcome back to For the Record, the Conference of Parties 22, a UN-sanctioned meeting on climate change adaptation and what the world collectively needs to do about climate change, is coming up in December. Fiji and the Pacific will be presenting their arguments, but the European Union, which stands firmly on the side of the Pacific, what's the message that we need to take across this year? We've got the Paris Agreement. We talked about how work programs need to be rolled out, but does the message need to change, or are we still sending the same message that the world needs to step up?
I think the message was got across very clearly in Paris last December. I think the world recognizes that something needs to be done, and this resulted in countries committing to real action in Paris. It resulted in the Paris Agreement. What we need to see in Marrakesh now is a real commitment to implementation. It's the implementation COP, the implementation meeting. And I think we need to come away with the clear understanding that we are now moving full steam ahead in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Every country has made commitments, and now we need to hold those countries to account. We need to make sure that they follow up with real action. And I think that is really going to be the proof of a successful meeting in Marrakesh. If we're able to establish a comprehensive and credible work plan for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. To have something really in place, complete by 2018, we're going to be really delivering on the promise of Paris.
And do you think we're in a position now where countries like Fiji will be able to tell the UN under the Paris Agreement, look, we're trying to work on this program, we need X million dollars? Should that be, would the check be signed in a month, 2 months?
Well, the financing is an important side of it as well. I mean, there was a commitment in Paris, and it's in the Paris Agreement, by developed countries to make available $100 billion for climate change related support. And I think we need to make progress on that in Marrakesh. We need to show that this money is coming on stream, that it's being made available. And I agree that Fiji and other developing countries need to make their voices heard. They need to say very clearly, okay, we now have agreed on what needs to be done. Now we need support in order to achieve the goals that we've set down in terms of adaptation to climate change and mitigation. We will be keeping to our pledge to actually bring about reductions of emissions by introducing renewable energy, but in the meantime our populations really do face a considerable challenge because of climate change. Yeah, we need the financing in order to face up to that.
Ambassador Jacobs, with that we've come to the end of our show tonight. Thank you very much for coming on For the Record.
Thank you very much indeed.
And that was For the Record for this evening. From me for tonight, good evening. I'll see you next Sunday.